So, Madagascar just collapsed. I swear to God, I cannot even get a single day at this point without some part of the world blowing up in my face, but hey, at least this time I did not mention Madagascar in any of my previous videos, so before it, actually happened, so you can't blame me for this one, people.
My friends, in the modern day age, I have seen
Probably the fall of Madagascar this week.
Anyway, on October 14th, 2025, a military coup in Madagascar would oust President Andry Rajoelina following weeks of youth-led protests against chronic water and power outages, corruption, and in general widespread poverty. The demonstrations, inspired by dissatisfaction with the government and the influence of youth activism, would lead to military intervention that installed a new governing council. The crisis would reach a turning point when the Army Personnel Administration Center, or CAPSAT, which is an elite military unit, would go and announce that it had suspended the Constitution and seized power. Soon after, Parliament would vote to impeach President Andry Rajoelina, and that was that. Which, now I'm going to let you all know this right now. I'm going to get a lot of these names wrong, so I do personally apologize for what it is that I'm about to say. And if there are any people from Madagascar here, I'm sorry. Led by Colonel Michael Randriarina, CAPSAT troops would go and enter the Amboasoritra, which, dear God, that is a name, presidential palace in the capital, which is Antananarivo, declaring that they had taken control of the government. The presidency would, of course, condemn what it called CAPSAT's illegal declaration to suspend the Constitution, describing the unit as, quote, a faction of military rebels, and calling its presence in the palace, quote, a manifest act of attempted coup d'etat and a serious violation of Republican legality, end quote. The military would respond saying that the presidency would be collectively assumed by its officers during a 2-year transition, leading to a referendum on a new constitution. 5 institutions, including the High Constitutional Court, the Independent National Electoral Commission, the Senate, the High Council for the Defense of Human Rights, and the High Court of Justice were all suspended, which the names doesn't really sound all that good in the first place. But of course, the National Assembly was going to remain in place. This, my friends, is all coming in the aftermath of Rajoelina having dissolved parliament after weeks of youth-led anti-government protests, saying the move was necessary in order to restore order and give young people a greater voice. Hours later, lawmakers would reconvene and vote to impeach him, setting the stage for the military's intervention as the president would go and flee the country. Subsequently, in the aftermath of this, the African Union would suspend the island nation's membership, which is now the latest in a long series of former French colonies that have seen the military take the reins of power since 2020, this being after coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, and Guinea. But here is the thing. All of this that I'm describing right now, this is way more complex than a simple power grab, as the population of Madagascar actually seems to largely support the military. Colonel Randriarina would go on to state that he was taking over as Madagascar's head of state because the country's High Constitutional Court invited him to do so in the absence of Rajoelina, who had straight up abandoned the country. He had previously said that the military had acted on behalf of the people, and he cast the coup as a move to restore the country, saying, and I quote, "We had to take responsibility yesterday because there is nothing left in the country. No president in the Senate, no government," end quote. The colonel would also say that the military leadership was accelerating the appointment of a new prime minister, quote, so that the crisis in the country does not last forever, end quote. But yeah, he didn't exactly give an exact time frame for that to happen. Really, my friends, at this point, we do not really know what to make of things, but you can be certain that the state of Madagascar is not doing good. As the military takeover is an attempt to stem the tides of chaos gripping the country, the question, of course, is always here on the history of everything is, how exactly did we get here? And on that note, what is going to happen next? Well, sit back and listen, my friends, because this story of coups, corruption, and backstabbing is going to need some serious context. And yeah, I'm serious when I say that. This is a long video, as you can already see. Like, this is probably the longest video that I have ever recorded. And I have to go through quite literally decades of coups, counter coups, power sharing agreements, backsliding onset agreements, and so much other crap in order to be able to explain things. You will understand what it is that I mean soon enough, though. Are you ready for this? I'm not ready for this. This is, oh dear God, I have literally been working on this for weeks now at this point. So you all better like this video. You better support this because this was a project that when people complain that, oh, I didn't talk about something enough, and I say, hey, I can't spend 2 weeks working on a video and go through every single detail because if I do, that will be A, inefficient for me, and B, there is no guarantee that you all would like the video in the first place. Show the support, and this is exactly how you do it. I'm also here in a hotel room in Japan on my own, and I've been working on this extensively while my wife is out adventuring, so you all better support me for this. I want to go and explore Japan, but I can't because I'm doing this.
But my friends, before we go any further, I would like to say that I just stole my wife's chair. Yeah, you heard me, Gabby. Yes, my friends, today's episode is sponsored by FlexiSpot, and this is my wife's new chair, the C7 Max, something that replaces her old one, which is this dinky little thing. Now, I'm going to be blunt with you, this has got to be one of the most comfortable and best chairs I have ever had in my life. I mean, just look at how rigid this is in comparison to what the C7 Max is capable of actually doing. I mean, this thing has a 3D adjustable headrest, absolute peak lumbar support, 5D armrests that are capable of going in any direction that you will, that also at the same time kind of sound like my knees at the age of 30. Don't look at me that way. And of course, a 0.2-inch thick latex memory foam seat that also is probably helpful for me now that I'm 30. Okay, this ad is actually starting to make me feel bad about myself.
Hello, it is I, Stephen Bell. And as you can see, I'm in my FlexiSpot C7 Max chair. And I'm here to show you about my favorite part. The footrest. Huzzah!
Genuinely, my friends, in the modern day and age, when it is that we are spending the majority of our time sitting down at desks in order to be able to do our work, study, and more, having an absolutely amazing chair is something that is vital, and the C7 Max is definitely something that I would recommend. If you go and use the code C730, which you can see up here, that is going to get you $30 off of this chair. And not only that, there's a 10-year warranty on it, plus a 30-day trial. If you are not satisfied, you're able to return the chair, no cost. And honestly, on top of all that, if you're looking for even more support, they just released a new chair called the C7 Morpher, which you should definitely check out, that has even better lumbar support. And if you're a bit more budget conscious, there's the C5. Black Friday is already going on, and you can get 60% off of these chairs in the first place, plus the additional $30 off that I just mentioned here with my code. So by all means, check it out, my friends. And now back to the show.
Anyway, to begin, Madagascar, the 4th largest island in the world, it is something that has a very rich and complex history, something that is shaped by its unique geographical location, its diverse ecosystems, and the interactions of various different cultures and civilizations over the course of thousands of years. With, of course, the subject that we're talking about here today, we don't really need to go fully into that history, but it's still important to mention since on this channel, we have quite literally never mentioned this country before, and hardly anyone in the Western world knows its story beyond the animated tale of a series of zoo animals from the New York Zoo getting stranded there. So, with that being said, let's dive in. From its position next to the mainland continent of Africa and in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar has been a trading hub for millennia. Over 2,000 years, the island would receive waves of settlers of various diverse origins, primarily Austronesian and Bantu. Centuries of intermarriages between both groups would create the Malagasy people of today, who are roughly an equal mixture of both groups. They speak Malagasy, which is a Austronesian language with Bantu, French, and Arabic influences, all kind of mixed in there together. By the 9th century, various kingdoms and chiefdoms would emerge in Madagascar, each with its own unique culture and political structure, and that is how things would exist. From the 10th century onward, Arab, Muslim, and Swahili traders would arrive and change the religious and cultural landscape. From that, hundreds of years would go by, and the Merina Kingdom, located in the Central Highlands, would become one of the most powerful and influential by the 16th century. They would develop a centralized kingdom with a powerful monarchy, which would later become the Kingdom of Madagascar under King, and look, I know for a fact that I'm gonna butcher this, Andriana Poinamarina, I think. I'm gonna put the name up here. Anyway, he ruled in the late 18th century. So yeah, Andrian's reforms would include the standardization of the Malagasy language, the establishment of a centralized administration, and the creation of a powerful military in order to be able to control the state. His son, Radama I, would further expand the kingdom, bringing much of the island under the family's control by the early 19th century. Now, technically speaking, I didn't need to go fully all the way back into that history, but you need to understand then when we are talking about the state of Madagascar that these tribal aspects, the family aspects, and the different cultural groups that we have described, all of these things are important things to mention for what shaped Madagascar and how it behaves today, particularly in relation to elections, because we're going to get into that. Anyway, it is here then that the Europeans come into play, though to be more accurate, they had technically arrived centuries earlier, not just in the 19th century. The first Europeans to arrive in Madagascar were the Portuguese. They were then followed by the French, who would go and establish trading posts and missions along the coast. And considering the location of Madagascar along international trade routes, it was quite simply too valuable for supply and security to be left alone. Moving into the late 19th century then, in 1883, France would declare a protectorate over Madagascar, effectively controlling its foreign policy and trade. Now, this move was driven by France's desire to expand its colonial empire and to counter British influence in the region. That protectorate status was then upgraded to full annexation in 1896, making Madagascar a full French colony. The French would introduce a new administrative system, build infrastructure such as roads and railways, would establish educational institutions, and even abolish slavery the same year that they took over in 1896, which had persisted far longer than it reasonably should have, but that is how slavery was for the most part in many parts of Africa. However, as we all know, history is not all sunshine and roses. It is complex because the French, along with doing things like ending slavery, also massively expanded and exploited the island's resources, including rubber, vanilla, and coffee, and imposed heavy taxes on the local population while brutally repressing any dissent. The pacification carried out by the French administration after the conquest would last more than 15 years, in response to the rural guerrillas being scattered throughout the country, harassing their forces. In total, the repression of the resistance to colonial conquest would cause several tens of thousands of Malagasy deaths. And people, naturally, were not happy from this. This is the way that things would persist for the next half century or so, until everything went to hell in a handbasket for the French in World War II, as we are all familiar. The occupation of France during the war would tarnish the prestige of the colonial administration in Madagascar, which galvanized the growing independence movement, leading to the Malagasy Uprising of 1947. Led by nationalists and former soldiers, the rebellion was brutally suppressed by the French, resulting in an estimated 11,000 to 80,000 deaths. I know when I say that, my friends, that it's very broad, but we genuinely do not know just how bad it truly was, just that it was bad. More importantly, though, this movement led the French to establish reformed institutions in 1956 under the Le Cadre, or the Overseas Reform Act, when I'm not butchering French, and Madagascar would move peacefully towards independence, which it ultimately would fully gain in 1960 with Philibert Tsernana, who would become its first president. So awesome! Now, here, as always, when we talk about a newly freed colonial nation, this is where things get both very hopeful, but also very murky and chaotic, leading to the modern day and age. You see, Tsernana was a ethnic Merina from the north, and he pursued a very pro-French policy, maintaining close ties with the former colonial power. His presidency would see some economic growth and the establishment of a multi-party system, but his policies also led to severe regional imbalances, with the North typically benefiting far more than other regions and contributing to the rise of opposition movements based off of ethnicity. Remember what we said here before, Madagascar has many different ethnic groups that have mixed with and established separate communities over the course of the last 1,000-odd years. Ethnic and regional identities are often more important than national ones, which in this case can prove to be quite a problem. Although Tsiranana was re-elected in January of 1972, political and labor unrest would culminate in an uprising known as the May 1972 Revolution. This, coupled with his own poor health, would lead him to appoint Major General Gabriel Ramanatsoa as Prime Minister with full powers of government, and from that, the First Republic would come to an end. But don't worry, that may have been the First Republic. We're going to be having a lot more. I promise you that much. You'll see what I mean. A plebiscite would be held on October 8th, 1972, and this would confirm Ramanatsoa as the head of the government. Now, there was no longer a president after Tsiranana resigned on October 11th. The new head of government would initiate radically different foreign and domestic policies, because under new agreements with France, French military and naval forces were removed from the island, and all French citizens were treated as aliens. New ties were established with the Soviet Union and other communist nations, and the country was withdrawn from the Franc zone. In 1973, a rural reorganization program in which elected committees would go and sell produce to state-owned companies would be initiated, and the government began to take more and more control of joint French-Malagasy organizations. Now, these policies that were put in place during this time that I have described were not well thought out, to say the least. Not only that, but this economic transition could not have occurred at a worse time, since 1973 was the year of the oil crisis. Almost immediately, the economy began to decay, and within a few years, it would practically collapse. No one was happy. And in the wake of political and social unrest, on February 5th, 1975, Ramanatsoa would go and hand power to a former Minister of the Interior, Colonel Richard Ratsmanadrava. He would assume the titles of President and Prime Minister, but then he was straight up assassinated just 6 days later. In the aftermath of this, a military directorate was then established, which would be dissolved on June 15th, after naming Lieutenant Commander Didier Ratsiraka as president and head of the new Revolutionary Council. A referendum was held on December 21st, 1975, and this would approve Ratsiraka as president under a new constitution that set up the new Democratic Republic of Madagascar, which I'm going to tell you all this right now. Surprise, surprise. It was not very democratic at all. You see, Ratsiraka, who had studied in France and was influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideologies, would go and nationalize key industries and implement land reforms. His regime would emphasize self-sufficiency and reduce dependence on foreign aid. However, his policies also led to many economic difficulties, including shortages of basic goods and food, and widespread decline in living standards. Ratsiraka's rule would be characterized by political repression and the suppression of any form of opposition, leading to a vast period of instability and unrest. In fact, when I say unrest, the economy collapsed so rapidly that only a few years after his takeover, Madagascar was declared bankrupt in 1979. Not a great start, definitely not a great start. By 1980, the Malagasy government would approach the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a loan to meet the gap in its balance of payments. And by 1981, it was negotiating for funds to cover payments on its growing international debt. The state was essentially in ruins, but through violent political oppression and control of institutions, Ratsiraka was somehow magically able to maintain power and win re-election in 1982. And it only gets worse from there. Well, how, you may wonder? Well, this guy straight up tried to fight against and ban martial arts. And no, I'm not talking about your local Taekwondo studio under Master Kim or anything like that. No, this straight up happened. In his second term in office, Ratsiraka was increasingly being opposed by youths within the capital that would participate in, and I'm not kidding about this, their own kung fu clubs. Yeah, these self-defense organizations, which were inspired by the films of Bruce Lee and a resurgent sense of Asian identity among the Malagasy people of the plateau, would emerge during the period of economic hardship of the early 1980s, and would recruit members from a relatively wide base of support that included the unemployed and uneducated, as well as those from middle and lower income groups. The martial arts movement had some 10,000 members by 1984, and was rumored to have adherents even within the army, which worried the government. They began to view this as a threat, and so in 1984, the government straight up banned the practice of martial arts, which sparked a violent protest. In mid-1985, Ratsiraka would then feel secure enough to take action against the kung fu clubs directly, and on the night of July 31st, 1985, the government would go and attack the movement's headquarters, killing its leader and many others. Yeah, you heard me right. In something that sounds like a plot straight out of a badly dubbed Hong Kong martial arts film of the late 1970s, the corrupt government of Madagascar sent in the army to wipe out a bunch of martial artists. Yeah, that is bad. But wait, it's only going to get worse. Under pressure from the IMF and the World Bank, the Malagasy government would embark on a program of privatization, devaluation of its currency, and cancellation of many government subsidies. Not because it wanted to, but because it was literally forced to. There was nothing left for them to do. They had already spent all of everyone else's money. The problem was, the privatizations largely benefited members of the president's circle, many of whom were able to acquire businesses on extremely advantageous terms that one could compare to the situation that happened in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was great for them, however, the moves were simultaneously resented by the bureaucracy, which faced a loss of employment, and by the general population, which also bore most of the economic hardship while the rich got richer. So it was then, as you would probably expect, over the course of the late 80s, Ratsiraka's popularity would continue to decline. Although, again, somehow he would win re-election in 1989, this is largely due to the fact that no one was really legally allowed to stand against him. So, I mean, doesn't really matter, I guess. People were, of course, pissed, and smaller parties and groups that once sided with the regime began to ally with each other instead and resist. The government would respond by making some concessions, but this was not enough, and if anything, only sped up the process of communist collapse, similar to that of the Soviet Union. As this was happening, another opposition alliance, the Vital Forces, or Forces Vives, FV, was created under the leadership of Albert Zafy, a professor at the University of Madagascar. Demonstrations favoring constitutional change would be held, and discussions about a possible revision of the constitution would continue without yielding any kind of real agreement between any parties. In June of 1991, the FV would announce the creation of a provisional counter-government to be treated as legitimate. This was followed by more demonstrations and a general strike of the population, and in August, well, the Presidential Guard would fire upon one of the demonstrations in front of the presidential palace, which would kill several people and also wound several others, including Zafy. He got wounded during this confrontation. The resulting anger of the population was righteous and had an almost immediate effect. Within 2 months, a new transitional government was established under the leadership of Zafy, who would go on to win the 1992 presidential election and would inaugurate the Third Republic of Madagascar. The new Madagascar constitution would establish a multi-party democracy. It would have a separation of powers that place significant control in the hands of the National Assembly, and the new constitution also emphasized human rights, social and political freedoms, and free trade. So, we're fine now, right? Well, no. See, Zafy's term, despite initially hopeful, ended up getting marred by political fragmentation, economic decline, allegations of corruption, and his introduction of legislation to give himself greater powers, such as the ability to directly appoint the prime minister himself. As a consequence of this, he was impeached in 1996, and an interim president, Norbert Rajoelina, would be appointed for the next 3 months prior to the next presidential election. And then guess what, guys? Guess what? You're not going to believe this, right? The communist dictator, Ratsiraka, the guy that literally just got ousted a few years ago, he comes back. But not as a dictator this time. Yes, you heard me right. Ratsiraka was actually voted back into power on a platform of decentralization and economic reforms for a second term, which lasted from 1996 to 2001. Literally the exact opposite of the communist stances that he had before. It really is wild, but then again, when I say voted, Ratsiraka did win the election, but absentee numbers were so high, and the total number of valid votes would only really account for about half the population, or half the electorate, I should say. People, I guess, really didn't believe that this would change anything, and to be honest, they were kind of right. Although the economy did improve over 1999 and 2000 because of the signing of an agreement that guaranteed the release of further credit by the IMF, the early 2000s would see more political crises. Yeah, this stuff is never ending for Madagascar, and you're starting to understand why this whole video was a massive headache for me to create in the first place. Now, what do I mean by crises? Well, the 2001 presidential election was contentious, to say the least. Although the official vote tally gave no candidate the necessary number of votes to declare victory outright, Ratsiraka's main opponent, called Mark Ravalomanana, would go and claim that he was the clear winner of the December election and that the results had been tampered with. Ravalomanana's supporters would then stage numerous demonstrations as well as a national strike that lasted several weeks. In February of 2002, Ravalomanana would declare himself the president and would establish his own administration, despite the fact that the international community did not recognize him as the legitimate leader of the country, and Ratsiraka still claimed the presidency. His supporters would go and fight with those of Ratsiraka in the street, and eventually both sides ended up controlling various different sections of the country. It was like its own miniature political gang civil war. Of course, this is not something that could last, and in April, the country's High Constitutional Court would declare Ravalomanana the winner of the disputed election. But fighting between the two sides did not cease until midsummer. This being when Ravalomanana's forces were finally able to take control over areas that were previously held by Ratsiraka's supporters. Like, it literally did not matter that they had an election. The people still had to fight in the streets in order to get a winner decided. That is how broken this is, and that is how it's going to be. Just to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. Ravalomanana would then go and secure recognition by the United States and France in late June and early July, respectively. And Ratsiraka, seeing the way the wind was going, would flee the country shortly thereafter. This was very obviously not good, and the political crisis would only weaken the country's economy and overall stability. Ravalomanana would promptly try to address the situation, implementing economic reforms and working tirelessly to entice foreign investors back into the country. And his efforts would win praise from foreign donors and international organizations. In 2004, the IMF and the World Bank would even announce plans to write off nearly half of Madagascar's outstanding debt, which was awesome. In fact, the negative economic impact of the political crisis was gradually overcome thanks to Ravalomanana's progressive policies. He would encourage investment in education and ecotourism, facilitate foreign direct investment, he would cultivate trading partnerships both regionally and internationally, and as a result of this, national GDP would grow by an average rate of around 7% per year under his administration. It genuinely was very impressive. Though, that being said, in the latter half of his second term, Ravalomanana was also criticized by domestic and international observers who accused him of increasing authoritarianism and corruption, which is a constant feature in Madagascar. Although Ravalomanana was gradually recognized by the international community as the legitimate leader of Madagascar, he still would face periodic unrest at home, including a failed coup attempt in 2003 and another one in 2006. In fact, with how much political instability was going on there, in mid-2006, Ravalomanana would go and announce that presidential elections were going to be held ahead of schedule in December of that year. Although some had concerns because some irregularities were noted, Ravalomanana still won re-election to the presidency in December, and elections were generally considered fair. So, okay, everything is good now, right? No, obviously not, or else you would not be here and this video would not be made. What are you talking about? I'm sorry to disappoint you, commenter. You can express that down below. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in late 2008, Andry Rajoelina, which is Antananarivo's mayor, would go and emerge as the leading opposition figure against the administration. Rajoelina would call for Ravalomanana to go and step down, accusing him of misappropriating public funds and ruling the country as a kind of dictator. The power struggle between Ravalomanana and Rajoelina would then come to a head in January of 2009, where dozens ended up getting killed during opposition protests. Rajoelina was ultimately fired from his mayoral post, and the struggle between the two leaders would develop into a tense stalemate, with sporadic bouts of violence between both sides' supporters. This crisis would only intensify in March, when the head of the army was removed by a faction of troops who no longer supported Ravalomanana's administration. Meanwhile, Rajoelina would express his intent to create a parallel government, something where he himself would be president, naturally speaking, and continue to call for Ravalomanana to go and resign. Of course, Ravalomanana would refuse to step down, and on March 15th, he proposed holding a referendum in an effort to resolve the crisis. This offer was rejected by Rajoelina. The next day, a presidential palace and the central bank were seized by the military, and Rajoelina would go and establish a presence at the palace. Now, although Ravalomanana had the support of the international community, on March 17th, he finally agreed to step down and hand power to the military. Military leaders, in turn, would go and transfer power to Rajoelina, who had already declared himself president and promised to draft a new constitution and hold elections within 2 years. Effectively, this entire thing was a coup and was widely condemned across the globe. Madagascar was subsequently suspended from both the African Union as well as the Southern African Development Community, so the AU and the SADC. All financial aid to Madagascar was completely cut off, and the state would become increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, as all of this is going down, back on the mainland of Africa, Ravalomanana would try to gather international support for his reinstatement to the presidency, even as his supporters were protesting for his return back home. As the political dispute would continue, initial attempts at negotiating an agreement between them would stall. That being said, though, there would be a breakthrough in early August when several international organizations would sponsor mediation talks in Mozambique. These talks would include not only Rajoelina and Ravalomanana, but also former presidents Zafi and Ratsiraka, both of which still had political support in Madagascar. As a result of these talks, it seems that there was, at first, some major success. On August 9th, 2009, it was finally announced that the four Malagasy politicians had agreed to the formation of a transitional unity government, and to the scheduling of presidential and legislative elections within 15 months. So they were going to do something. We're good now, right? No. Again, we are not. The four politicians would meet again in Mozambique for several days, beginning in late August, to decide how to allocate positions in the transitional unity government. But they were unable to come to an agreement about the top 3 positions by the September 4th deadline. Because of this, Rajoelina basically said, "Screw you guys, I'm going home," and announced that he was forming his own transitional government. And surprise, surprise, guess who was the president? Him. Go figure. Additional talks, luckily, were held, and on October 6, 2009, it was announced that they had come to an agreement on the top 3 positions in the transitional unity government. Rajoelina would be allowed to remain as president, on the condition that he was not going to be a candidate in the next presidential election. More talks would follow into early November, and on November 7th, 2009, Rajoelina, Ravalomanana, Zafi, and Ratsiraka would sign an agreement providing for a slightly revised transitional unity government structure with Rajoelina remaining as president, but he would rule with 2 co-presidents. And okay, now we're good, right? It's over. No, the hell we are not. Dear frickin' God, it never ends. Yeah, that agreement literally began to collapse within a month, as in December of 2009, Rajoelina refused to participate in the last round of power-sharing talks. So, instead of waiting, Ravalomanana, Zafi, and Ratsiraka, and international mediators would just proceed without him, and reached an agreement on December 8th. But Rajoelina refused to accept it, of course. Nonetheless, on December 18th, Ravalomanana, Zafi, and Ratsiraka would announce the new transitional unity government. And Rajoelina decided to throw a hissy fit, of course. Within hours of this happening, Rajoelina would go and dismiss the prime minister who had been appointed in October as a result of the previous power-sharing agreement talks. And on December 20th, he announced that he was outright abandoning the power-sharing agreement entirely. It was all dead in the water. Really, at this point, just about everyone, both internationally as well as internally within Madagascar, were getting pretty sick of all this crap. International pressure was placed on Madagascar to adhere to the agreement, but really, it was the threat of military intervention in yet another coup by Madagascar's armed forces that finally made Rajoelina go and come to the table again. The military outright told him that if he did not end the political crisis, they were going to end it for him. So it was then, on April 14th, 2010, that Rajoelina would announce that he was willing to form an interim government with the opposition, under the terms of a new agreement proposed by France, South Africa, and the Southern Africa Development Community. That's it. So now we're done here. Awesome. Dear Lord, I thought that would never be over. Now everything was fine, and Madagascar lived happily ever after, with its 4 major politicians living in a cabin together in the woods, singing Kumbaya and baking pies together. That's it. You hear my sarcasm? Yeah, somehow we are not done yet. It's only going to get worse. Talks between Rajoelina and the other 3 Malagasy leaders would ultimately fail. The very next month, Rajoelina, by himself, would go and form what he deemed to be a neutral government. He also scheduled a constitutional referendum and presidential and parliamentary elections for later in the year, all of which he then ended up postponing, mind you. Oh, and did I forget to mention that in August of 2010, a Malagasy court would convict former President Ravalomanana in absentia of murder and sentenced him to life in prison with hard labor? Because, yeah, that happened. So, yeah, anyway, the constitutional referendum that I mentioned just now, yeah, that was held on November 17th, 2010. And a key part of that new constitution was a lower age requirement for the presidency. Which, hey, conveniently, by lowering it, that was a change that would make the young Rajoelina eligible for the position. Surprise, surprise. And even more conveniently, it did not actually set an end date for Rajoelina's transitional regime. Although the new constitution was approved, the referendum was marred by a boycott of the primary opposition groups and was widely criticized by the international community. Also, on November 17th, an element within the army would announce that it was going to overthrow Rajoelina's government, which he naturally took offense to. The attempted coup would quickly fail, though, leading to a standoff between the small group that supported the coup and the rest of the army that still supported Rajoelina. Ultimately, the conspirators would surrender a few days later. So it was then that the new constitution was launched in December of 2010. Rajoelina would declare the start of the Fourth Republic. Yay! It's now over. Wait, now hold on, that's 2010. Oh dear God, we still have 15 years left until today. Someone please just take me out of my misery now at this point. I'm tired. Yes, my friends, so fast forward by just around a year, and another SADC brokered agreement was signed in September of 2011, which was set to establish yet another new unity government being formed in November of that same year. The agreement would also mean that the presidential and legislative elections were to be held within a year to finally return things to a sense of normalcy, but hey, surprise, surprise, those also got delayed due to political fighting. It sucks. It really sucks. And mind you, as all of this is going down, the economy of Madagascar is in a freaking tailspin. The country remained diplomatically isolated and cut off from much-needed donor aid and tourism revenue, which only served to further punish the Malagasy people that grew increasingly frustrated with their government that couldn't get its crap together. Following the pattern that we have then seen time and time here again so far, some progress was made, again, a bit over a year later, but then hey, guess what? That comes crashing down again too. In January of 2013, both Rajoelina and Rajoelina would agree to yet another SADC plan, which stipulated that neither one of them would run in the upcoming presidential election. But again, we all know how this story works by now, especially if you've been watching this. That would end up breaking down when Rajoelina's wife later declared that she was going to run for president instead. Yeah, that was a loophole that pissed off Rajoelina so much that he said, screw this, and declared that he was also running. This, of course, angered the international community, and funding for the polls were withdrawn. I swear to God, frickin' children, man. Still, something would work out, I guess. In August, the candidacy of Rajoelina's wife and Rajoelina, as well as that of former President Ratsiraka, who, surprise, surprise, had also registered as a candidate, that was actually struck down by the country's electoral court, and the elections were pushed back once again to allow time for the country's electoral commission to revise the list of certified candidates to reflect the exclusion of those three. I swear to God, literally none of these people were willing to not act like spoiled children, and the court finally had to intervene and say, screw all of you, and that's the only way anything was going to get resolved. And so, later, in 2013, we finally do have an election. The first round of the presidential election was finally held in October, with more than 30 candidates on the ballot. Among those were two primary candidates that stood out. You had Richard Jean-Louis Robinson, who was supported by Rajoelina, and okay, look, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to try and say this name without butchering it, but I swear that is impossible. Harry Marshall Rakatoramana, Rajanari Mampianenana. Probably adding syllables in there. Holy crap. Okay, look, I'm probably just going to call him Harry for the rest of this. He was seen as an ally of Rajoelina. As it was, in the end, Harry would go and receive the most votes, with Richard coming in second, about 21% and 16% respectively, and they would advance to a runoff election that was held that December. Results released in early January of 2014 would show that Harry was the winner, with 53.5% of the vote, and international observers regarding the election as fair, despite allegations from other candidates of fraud. The court would certify the result, and Harry was inaugurated on January 25th, 2014. Finally, things seemed to be returning to normal, and as a result, the AU and SADC would lift their suspensions of the country in the following days, and economic aid once again began to flow into the country. In order to get things back on track, Harry would go and implement austerity measures and sought to attract foreign investment. But his presidency was also, of course, plagued by corruption and political infighting. Opposition parties and civil society groups would often criticize his government for not doing enough to address the country's deep-rooted problems, and his popularity would wane as economic hardship would persist, with an attempted impeachment even taking place, but ultimately that would get struck down by the High Court. That is the way things would run until 2018, when the next presidential election would take place. And that, my friends, is where, once again, we see a return to political chaos and the modern day. Go figure. Yeah, like we saw years earlier, everything went to hell in a handbasket in April of 2018 when Harry was accused of having new electoral laws passed in an attempt to stop other potential candidates, including former President Rajoelina, from being able to stand in the presidential election. This resulted in mass protests. 2 people got killed, which made people then protest even more, and security forces just cracked down even more after that. Naturally, these new electoral laws were challenged at the High Constitutional Court, which struck down part of them in May. Still, it was chaotic, and later that month, the High Constitutional Court would order that a coalition government had to be established in an effort to end the ongoing political crisis. In June, Harry would go and name his new prime minister, Christian Nsé, to head a government of national unity, and would appoint a new cabinet. Nsé would go and schedule the upcoming presidential election then for November 7th, 2018. And guess what? Do we get new characters stepping into the scene to change things around and introduce some new blood and save the day? No, of course not. What are you even on about? It's the same people that for the last decade have been screwing everything up, and we've been going on and on and on about. I swear to God, it's a broken record in Madagascar. Harry, as the incumbent, would step down 60 days before the November election, as he was required to do so by the Constitution. The president of the Senate, Rivo Rakatovo, Harry's ally, he would then become the acting president. Now, at this point, technically speaking, I do need to go ahead and say I was wrong when I said that we were not getting any new blood, as there were, again, technically speaking, 36 contenders for the presidency. However, that being said, it really does not matter, as the only people with any chance of real political power were the people from earlier in the story, including former presidents Rajoelina as well as Rajoelina. They would sweep the board in the election, but not enough to outright secure the presidency, as none of the candidates in the November 7th election would win more than the required 50% of the vote. The top 2 vote getters, Rajoelina with about 39% and Rajoelina with about 35%, would then advance to a runoff scheduled in December. But wait, you may wonder, what about the incumbent president, Harry? Yeah, he got less than 9% of the vote, so not even close. He was out of the race, and now it was up to the 2 former presidents before him again. Go figure. Provisional results from the December 19th, 2018 runoff election would show Rajoelina as the winner, taking more than 55% of the vote. Rajoelina, however, would denounce the results as fraudulent. No surprise there, and he filed complaints with the High Constitutional Court seeking to have the election results cancelled. On January 8th, 2019, however, the court would uphold the results, having rejected Rajoelina's complaints, and Rajoelina was inaugurated as the president in January of 2019. Finally, it is over. Sort of. Yeah, I'm gonna need to clarify this, because what I mean is that we finally get to the last guy that is in charge before everything that went down this October went and took place. It was a very long journey, but we did actually make it. In the 2019 parliamentary elections, Rajoelina's party would win an absolute majority in the National Assembly. It won 84 out of the 151 seats in it, while supporters of former President Rajoelina only won 16 seats, with the other 51 seats going to other independents and minor parties. This meant in turn that for once in the past decade, the government actually seemed to have a mandate to rule and should have been able to accomplish things, if only everything did not go to absolute crap. You see, the entire time that I've been talking about the story here, my friends, I've really only been talking about the politics of Madagascar for the most part. I mentioned the economy and how people were suffering because it was not good, but oh, just wait, it was about to get so much worse. To go back in time and explain a little bit of this so you understand what I'm talking about. Although Madagascar became independent from France in 1960, the entire economic system of the country still basically operated like a colony. Instead of developing local industries that would benefit its people, Madagascar's economy was still largely based on extracting natural resources like minerals, timber, and seafood. Many of these resources were then exported to wealthier nations, which, surprise, surprise, stopped buying as many things during the COVID-19 pandemic. Combine that with a lack of visiting tourists from said pandemic, which the state heavily relied on for many local industries, and you have a recipe for disaster. And this is something that would only get worse should any other major thing happen, like, a natural disaster, which is exactly what kind of thing ended up happening. This was going to be absolutely terrible. To give you an idea of how bad this is, Madagascar has one of the worst infrastructure networks in the entire world. According to CIA data, the country has around 50,000 kilometers of roads, but among those, only 6,000 or so are paved, and many of those roads, even when paved, are in terrible condition, meaning it's difficult for farmers and businesses to transport goods. Cyclones and heavy rains will frequently go and destroy roads and bridges, cutting off entire regions of the country from trade and emergency aid. This is made worse when you realize that a huge percentage of the 32 million people of the country are subsistence farmers, and natural disasters could easily wipe out people's crops. And that is exactly what happened immediately after the pandemic. The 2021 to 2022 drought was one of the worst on record, with some areas of the country receiving little to no rainfall for extended periods. This lack of rainfall would devastate crops, especially maize, which is a staple food for many households. The drought led to widespread crop failures, with farmers reporting losses of up to 90% of all of their harvest. This loss of agricultural production had a devastating impact on food availability and household income. By late June of 2021, the World Food Program was reporting that 75% of children had abandoned school and were simply begging for or foraging for food. Dust storms were only going to make this much worse. Now, my friends, the events of this time period were absolutely horrific, and there's a limit to what it is that we can show here, with millions of people entering famine conditions. One report would state that people were eating, quote, cactuses, swamp plants, and insects, end quote, while also reporting that mothers were trying to mix clay and fruit to feed their families. The famine would push many households into deep poverty, as they were forced to sell any assets and livestock they had to buy food. This sale of assets would only further weaken their future productive capabilities, and their income would drop further. Food shortages would then lead to internal displacement, as people would migrate in search of food and better opportunities. That migration would often result in overcrowding and increased pressure on resources in the receiving areas, primarily in the city. In fact, many rural poor would go into the city thinking that they could find relief, only to find nothing. In fact, looking at poverty rates in 2022, 75% of the national population was poor, 80% in rural locations, and 55% in urban areas. Now, while rural poverty would fall slightly over the decade, there was a significant increase of 31% in urban poverty. This has been especially dramatic in secondary cities, where poverty would increase from 46% all the way up to 61%. The situation was not good. People were angry, and the government attempted, of course, with international aid to help the population and distribute food, but this is a problem that, even with the worst of it out of the way, that is still something that persists to this day. Millions of people across the country of Madagascar today do not have jobs. They do not have ready access to food or water or even electricity, with regular outages in the capital for up to 12 hours at a time. And the worst part is, their situation does not seem to change no matter who is in power. Speaking of which, you know what time it is? Yeah, that's right. Election time. Oh boy. In the lead up to the election in 2023, some major drama went down. Reports emerged that Rajoelina had held French citizenship since the year 2014, which, for those of you listening, that may be a little bit confusing, like, why is that a problem? Well, Article 42 of Madagascar's nationality code indicated that if an adult Malagasy voluntarily acquired a foreign nationality, they would lose their Malagasy nationality. And Article 46 of Madagascar's 2010 constitution states that a candidate for the presidency has to be of Malagasy nationality. So, not only would that make Rajoelina ineligible for running for president, it would also mean his entire presidency in the first place had been invalid. Dear freaking Lord, Madagascar politics are messy. The opposition, of course, tried to have Rajoelina disqualified, but the High Constitutional Court would dismiss their challenges and also approve Rajoelina's candidacy for the next presidential election. Because, of course, hey, when you fill your courts with your friends, they have your back, I guess. So it was then, on September 6th, 2023, Rajoelina would officially announce what everyone knew would happen. He was going to be a candidate in the upcoming November presidential election. After the High Constitutional Court would confirm his eligibility and in accordance with the Constitution, He stepped down as president on September 9th in order to run for re-election. Now, here is the weird thing. Under the Constitution, the Senate president, Harimanana Razafimanehefa, dang, that is a name, he was supposed to become the acting president. But for some reason, he declined, and Prime Minister Christian Nitze, who was a Rajoelina ally, took over the role instead. Basically, even though he was not president for the time, Rajoelina had a yes man who would do whatever it is that he wanted anyway, and the transfer of power was then criticized by the opposition as a coup within the institution. This information was made even worse when the next month, Razafimanehefa would say that he didn't do that voluntarily. He'd been pressured to decline the role of acting president, but now he was ready to accept it. Which I guess, okay, I don't think there's any take-backsies when it comes to the government. Anyway, he wasn't an ally of Rajoelina, I guess, so the government's response was to remove him as Senate president and replace him with another Rajoelina ally, Richard Ravalomanana, and also, from that, assume the role of acting president of the country in late October. It was weird, and naturally, the opposition did not like this, but either way, it's now election time. The 13 candidates running for president included Rajoelina as well as former presidents Mark Ravalomanana and Harry Raja, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the rest of his name. President Harry. And naturally, with so much support split between them and tensions already quite high, things got violent pretty fast, as supporters of one candidate would fight supporters of the others. In fact, things got so tense that a group of 10 candidates would even band together and boycott election campaigning, instead holding unauthorized rallies to protest the government's handling of the election, which they said was rigged to favor Rajoelina, the dismissal of their concerns over the dual nationality that Rajoelina apparently had, and the maneuvers that he had engaged in to fill the role of acting president with one of his lackeys. As for how that went down, well, the government was now fully under the control of Rajoelina's allies, and they did not take very kindly to this. And crackdowns would ensue, with rallies being dispersed with disproportionate force leading to many injuries. Because of how tense things got, the election original date of November 9th was pushed back by a week to November 16th. And as the new date drew closer, the climate seemed to get even worse, and there were even calls for the election to be further postponed. The collection of 10 presidential candidates would go and announce that they were boycotting the election and urged their supporters to straight up not vote, which, you can imagine, would drastically affect the outcome. Rajoelina was declared the winner of the November 16th election, taking almost 59% of the vote, but voter turnout was 46%, the lowest in a presidential election in the entire country's history. Really, it would be pretty easy to argue that the entire thing was invalid. But he was now president, and his new term was set for December 16th, 2023. And that, my friends, finally brings us to 2024 and 2025, when everything would hit the fan once again. Now, there's not much to say about 2024. The economic situation grew worse, blackouts grew more common, the population grew angrier, and all of these things were taking place and building a storm that was set to finally unleash in 2025, just as popular protests would take place all over the world in different countries during the Gen Z fall. In the case of Madagascar, September 18th would ultimately become the start of it all. On that day, two politicians, one by the name of Clemence Rajoelina and the other Baba Finiri, would go and publicly call for mass protests in front of the Senate in Anosi to denounce chronic power outages, water cuts, and systemic corruption in public utilities. Again, this being something that has been a longtime problem for many years over the course of the whole country and is a common pain point for many people. They would label their movement Tsi Manaki Lembanana. Butchering all of this, I know for a fact, but basically, we refuse to be trampled. And also, the other name was Fed Up with Load Shedding. More movements were to follow, and organization would begin to take place, largely at first on Facebook. In fact, a Facebook page by the name of Gen Z Madagascar would emerge as the primary organizing hub for the movement, rapidly gaining over 100,000 followers in the span of just 5 days. It would grow far more beyond that as Gen Z began to rally. Now, how do we know that it is a Gen Z protest, you may wonder? Well, the page's logo drew inspiration from the manga One Piece, replacing the traditional straw hat of the Mugiwara pirates with a Malagasy-style hat. Yes, One Piece is now back again in the story. I really do probably need to do a full video dedicated to exactly just that. In short, you know if One Piece is involved, it's going to be Gen Z. Anyway, fast forward to September 24th, the day before the mass protests across the country would break out. Rajoelina was actually in New York City for the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, where he was delivering a speech. At the same time this was happening, back in his home country, people were trying to gather to protest, which the capital had banned, but large forces of militarized police would cordon off areas and restrict people's movements, making them very angry. That next day, on the 25th, thousands of young people would attempt to gather at Amboijatovo, which is a very ironic twist of fate because this is a place that had been historically designated as the place of democracy by Andry Rajoelina himself back in the year 2009. Ah, how the turntables. They tried to gather in the place called the place of democracy, and the government, which made it, was like, no, you can't do that. Anyway, police blocked off all access points, preventing people from gathering. Protesters then tried to reach the square from multiple other neighborhoods, but each route was met with tear gas bombs and rubber bullets from police. Now, instead of dispersing people, though, these tactics only served to anger them more. Many people began to gather. More marches began to take place. More one-piece Jolly Rogers began to fly, and finally, the violence would truly begin. It is from this point here, my friends, that protesters began to take things far more seriously. They began to set up barricades, burn tires, throw rocks at police, even though the police were shooting them with rubber bullets. 3 homes of different politicians that were close to Rajoelina were set on fire by rioters, and looting in the capital began to take place in the afternoon, with one of the first targets being a train station. Looters would set a hotel, bank, and stations of the country's cable car system on fire, as violence would escalate and rubber bullets began to turn from that point into real bullets. Then the blood began to flow. Outside of the city, the offices of Jarama, the corrupt national electricity and water provider that constantly was having blackouts, was attacked by protesters. Chaos would seize the day. That, my friends, is how things would begin on September 25th, 2025. And from there, it would only continue. Not just for the next several days, but for the next several weeks. The next day, in Ansarabe, the 3rd largest city of the country, protesters would gather at the city's train station at around 10 a.m. before being forcibly dispersed with tear gas by police. By noon, looting had begun, with no real way to stop it, as the majority of police officers had already been redeployed to the capital to deal with protests there. In response, the government had to do something. And so, as all this is going down, during his address, starting at 7:30 p.m., live from New York City, not even in the country, Rajoelina would announce the dismissal of Jean-Baptiste Olivier, who was the Minister of Energy and Hydrocarbons, under the pretext that he was, and I quote, not doing his job, end quote. Rajoelina would further condemn the violence which occurred after the protests as nothing more than acts of destabilization, and accused opposition politicians of taking advantage of the protests to try and orchestrate a coup against him. Of course, making said accusations did not exactly calm the situation down at all, and things would only grow worse, with people getting killed daily in the violence. Protesters would continue to gather in the capital, with some wearing colored straw hats as a symbol. Rajoelina would return from New York, and from there would summon a meeting with the military and police commanders to try and deploy military and security forces to secure fuel stations and storage, along with the commercial areas to try and keep the country intact. As the protests would continue, he would realize that by that point, there really was no way to keep his current government in place. People were simply too angry. And so, in a desperate bid to try and quell the unrest, he announced that he was going to dissolve the government on September 29th. Not for himself personally, just the dismissal of his prime minister and his government, and from that, he would have a 3-day period for choosing a new prime minister. Okay, fine. But that did not have the desired calming effect, and a strict curfew was put in place from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. daily in the capital. It is from this point then, heading into the beginning of October, that protests began to spread to other countries and towns across the country. Labor unions would go and join with the protests, and calls were made for a general strike. As this was happening, the government accused the demonstrators of vandalism and of promoting a coup. You know, the exact thing to say to a bunch of people that are already really pissed off. At this point, realizing the situation was absolutely hopeless for the current government, the opposition began to rally, with opposition leaders Rivo Rakatovo announcing that his party and allies were not going to be joining any government under the leadership of Rajoelina, and asked him to step down. Still, okay, you know what? All is not lost. There is some hope for the government. Counter-protests were announced from Rajoelina supporters, and guess what? A whopping couple hundred people showed up. versus tens of thousands angry anti-Rajoelina protesters. Yeah, okay, you see how bad it is then. The government was screwed. By October 8th, Rajoelina was trying to walk back his stronger words and instead negotiate with protest leaders. But these talks were simply rejected. The violence would continue. Chaos would reign until finally, the military would intervene and everything changed. On October 11th, an elite military unit called CAPSAT would rebel against Rajoelina and join the protests. The soldiers, riding in armored vehicles, would accompany protesters to a main square within the capital, and there, Colonel Michael Rajoelina, the commander of the unit, would say that his soldiers were going to disobey orders to quell the protests, and he called for Rajoelina to step down. His words were met with cheers from the Gen Z protesters. The result was remarkably quick. General Richard Ravalomanana, a close ally of Rajoelina, was removed as president of the Senate by the military. Rajoelina was nowhere to be found then, as with the aid of the French, he had fled the country on a flight out. After not appearing in public for days, Rajoelina would make a speech on October 13th on social media saying that he fled Madagascar in fear of his life after being told that there was a plot to assassinate him at his presidential palace. He called for the Constitution to be respected and said that he was still the leader of the country, but he would not say where he was. That next day, in order to stop anything from happening, he issued a decree from his secret location to dissolve parliament, which was an attempt to block any votes by lawmakers to impeach him, which did not work. Lawmakers, tired of all the chaos, ignored the decree and overwhelmingly voted to impeach him. Right after the vote, Rajoelina, the military colonel, would appear with other soldiers in front of an old symbolic presidential palace and would announce the military was taking power, with a military council that would then rule for at least 18 months before new elections would take place. From that, my friends, it really is a simple thing. The military would begin to consolidate power. The next day, on October 15th, Madagascar state television would announce that Rajoelina was going to be inaugurated on the 17th of October as President of Madagascar, and during his inaugural speech at the High Constitutional Court, he would say that it marked a, quote, historic turning point, end quote, for Madagascar, and he expressed a determination to break with the past and open a new chapter in the nation's life. Rajoelina would thank the Gen Z protesters. He stated that his first three priorities would be an investigation into the water and power company of Jarama for corruption, rice farming for food supply, and appointing a prime minister and government to actually get things under control. Finally, it seems, stability really did seem to be possible, but who could actually say what was going to happen? Naturally, of course, the international community has not been silent on the matter, and they haven't been happy. The coup and the formation of the new government led to the suspension of Madagascar from the African Union. This move by the African Union is likely to isolate the new administration of Madagascar, but there's some serious doubts as to whether or not that suspension is actually going to mean anything or cause any kind of difference, as the organization over the years has lost quite a bit of credibility because of its failure to actually promote peace and stability across the continent as it plans. I mean, after all, we have seen countless numbers of coups from Gabon, Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, and all of their memberships were suspended because of similar coups, and did it do anything? Well, not really. On the Western side of things, the European Union would call for the restoration of democratic values through a national dialogue, though that is unlikely to happen at this point. French President Emmanuel Macron would express deep concern over the situation in Madagascar and affirmed, quote, France's friendship with Madagascar's people, end quote. Macron also asserted that constitutional order must be preserved in the state, and he added that, quote, we just need to make sure that it is not taken over by military factions or foreign interference, end quote. Which, yeah, hey, I do get, but also that relationship with France is kind of one of the double-edged swords for politicians in Madagascar. People don't necessarily like it, even if it's useful, as in fact, on the 25th of October, the new government would revoke Rajoelina's Malagasy citizenship, citing laws against dual nationality. So, yeah, that's not something one can simply really talk through. As for what is going to happen next, who can really say? Madagascar right now is at a critical crossroad for its future, both domestically and internationally. Despite how poor it is, its position in the Indo-Pacific as well as its natural resources make Madagascar an extremely valuable partner for both the West and also the East. It is one of the largest producers of cobalt, granite, and nickel, materials that are used for producing batteries, lithium batteries that are necessary for electric vehicles. The country is the fourth largest supplier of graphite to the United States. Japan and South Korea import roughly a quarter and a third of their nickel from Madagascar, respectively. Other nations, such as Canada and the United Kingdom, they are also major purchasers. And these resources are necessary for aerospace equipment, aircraft, electric vehicles, nuclear energy, renewable energy systems. All of these things rely on key elements that Madagascar is a large supplier of. And in the race that we are seeing in the Indo-Pacific to dominate the region, its trade, and protect shipping, that is something that is a very crucial factor. As it is, considering the less than democratic circumstances that the country finds itself in, the new military administration is arguably more likely to lean towards China or Russia for support if needed. China remains Madagascar's third largest import partner, having massively invested in infrastructure such as railroads and ports in the state in an effort to try and boost economic ties as well as link the island through its Belt and Road Initiative project. However, that means little right now in a state as poor as Madagascar is. A significant chunk of its economy still relies on Western countries importing raw materials. As a result, Andry Rajoelina is going to have to balance things between the two sides. A hard task to be sure, but if he succeeds, then maybe, for once, over the course of this entire video, things will finally turn around for the failed island country. Unfortunately, we will have to wait and see at this point, as only time will tell. That, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today, and oh dear freaking god, this is the longest video I've ever produced. You all, I swear, you all better like this video, because the amount of time and effort that this took is really insane. I think my script, looking at this, was 19 pages long in preparation, the longest one I have ever done. So yeah, thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Show some support and love if you can. I apologize this took as long as it did, but I have been traveling around Japan for a week now at this point, and the amount of work I had even prior to this was insane. I've been working on this script for the last like 2 weeks. Goodbye, everyone. I'll see you all next time. Best of luck to you.